Let's start with the biblical text. Matthew chapter 27. There came a rich man, that's important, from Arimathea named Joseph, who had himself become a disciple of Jesus. Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and placed it in his own new tomb, that's important, that he had cut out of the rock. He rolled a big stone in front of the entrance and went away. Well, clearly we're not talking about a cemetery like you'd find in Waxahachie or Fort Worth or Dallas, just to start with. That's clear. So what is it? Another text, we're told in Luke 24:12, Peter got up and ran to the tomb, bending over. That will become important. He saw the strips of linen lying by themselves. Why did he have to bend over? John 20, verses 3 to 5. So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running. The other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in. And John 20, verse 11, Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb. What does all this bending over, looking in, rock cut have to do with the burial of Jesus? So the New Testament text tells us, we've seen, 1, the tomb was cut out of the rock. 2, it had a doorway or entrance. 3, the doorway was obviously low, so a person must bend over to look in. Well, all of that is interesting information. Let's go to just south of Jerusalem to Akeldama, which is the field of blood, it's associated with Judas and his suicide and the potter's field and all that. And there is a monastery, the Onuphrius monastery, and on the spur of rock where it is, that limestone, down at the end there, you can see I've marked the entrances to tombs. In fact, there are lots of tombs all over that area, not just 2. But I've marked 2 doorways that go into the hillside, 2 tombs that are cut out of the rock. This is one of them. And this is an entrance to a very important tomb. We call it the tomb of Annas, connected with Annas, the priest who's mentioned in the Gospel of John, one of the most powerful and rich men in Judea at the time of Christ. It's a very large entrance. It is cut out of the rock. It is a door, but it's far too high. You can walk into that and reach your hand up to try to touch the top. It's very different. But it's something, and it's from the 1st century, from the time of Christ. Let's go in. Inside we find a room cut out of the hillside, a man-made cave, very ornamental. You can see there is another doorway going into another chamber on the left. There are some small niches cut into the wall at the bottom and a very ornamental ceiling. The work of Leen Ritmeyer, a Dutch archaeological architect, has reconstructed what that would have looked like at the time of Annas and indeed at the time of Jesus. The outside of that tomb on the hillside he has also reconstructed using other examples that we know of in the area to give an impression of the sort of thing it would have looked like. So the dark area is the present remains, and the architecture you can see is a reconstructed idea of how it would have looked on the top. A very rich man, for what would be the equivalent of a billionaire in our society, a multi-billionaire probably. Here's another one. This is called the Tomb of the Sanhedrin. And it, again, a large door going into very large rooms inside. In fact, inside that, there is room for 63 bodies in different locations, different loculi, as we call them. And you'll see those later on. But again, the door is very high, although it's cut out of the rock. By the way, it's got nothing to do with Sanhedrin. That was a name that got stuck onto it during the Middle Ages. If you're interested, I can tell you how the name got on and so on. But that's another story. So let's continue. Now, this one is called the Herodian family tomb. Again, this is a name that has got stuck on this tomb. It's near the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. It's nothing to do with King Herod, but somebody, one of the first people who looked at it was, I think, Conrad Schick, and he said this probably was so ornamental, and there are 5 rooms cut out on the hillside, and the southernmost has 2 richly ornamented stone sarcophagi in which to push the bodies, so it must have been the family of King Herod. Well, we don't know who it belonged to. It certainly was someone very rich. It certainly was the time of either Herod or later in the 1st century, but before the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70, but we don't know who it belonged to. But what you can see here is there are steps going down, and then there is a doorway, and this is fairly low, cut out of the rock. And we're going to come back to look at this tomb a little later. Let's look at another. Let's go north to Jezreel. And there is a 1st century tomb, and we see a doorway cut out of the rock, and it's very low. You'd have to bend over to look in. So this is the kind of thing that the New Testament is describing, and here it is in Israel, a door that's fairly low, sealed, as we'll see later, by that big stone, and you go inside, and there's a cave cut out of the rock where they would have buried someone. Indeed, there are several. So, the New Testament text tells us the tomb was cut out of the rock. We've seen, yes. It had a doorway or entrance. Yes. The doorway was low, so a person must bend over to look in. Yes. Good. Let's add something. The text also told us the entrance was closed by a large stone that could be rolled into place. Interesting? Let's look at the text again. Matthew 27, Joseph of Arimathea rolled a big stone in front of the entrance and went away. After the Sabbath, at dawn on the 1st day of the week, there was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven and, going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. Mark 16, verses 3 and 4, and they asked each other, these are the women going to the tomb, who will roll the stone away from the entrance to the tomb? But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, says Mark, had been rolled away. Again, Luke 24, verse 2, the women found the stone rolled away from the tomb. So let's look at that Herodian family tomb again. There is the entrance, steps going down, a small door, and a big stone that looks like a huge millstone, big stone disc. And it's got a groove that is running in, and we've gone down and sealed it. And the flat area would have probably been built up with stone blocks and been quite a large ornamental top to the tomb that has since disappeared. And from the inside, you see that stone. In fact, that picture and pictures like it have been used a great deal to illustrate the Easter story. You'll see them on magazine covers and so on. It's been used a great deal because you can imagine one of the disciples coming down and looking in through that. All right. Let's go back to the one in Jezreel, which is up north. There you see the stone, a large stone disc running in a groove that could be rolled into place. And to get it back, you can see the women would have had quite a problem because you would have to get sticks under. You can't just push that thing back. Get sticks underneath it and push it, levers, push it up, then put in a wedge, push it up a bit more, push it up until it got into place. You'd need some men to do that. Of course, it would be much easier to get into place. Take out the little wedge underneath and it'll roll down in and it's sealed. So you can imagine all of this is making the resurrection of Jesus much more interesting to me. That the fact that how did the resurrection take place? If they put his body in there, if there was no resurrection, how did he get out? The idea that some people have said, oh, Jesus got, well, you know, he swooned on the cross. He didn't really die. He fainted, and they thought he was dead, and they put him in the tomb, and he came to, and he got out. How? Big stone. It'd be hard enough for several men to move it from outside, let alone one person from inside to push it over. I don't think so. But there we are. There's the idea of the stone. You see, it's beginning to make the text come alive. And how are we doing it? The results of archaeology. So, we've seen the tomb was cut out of rock. It had a doorway. The doorway was low. A person must bend over to look in. The entrance was closed by a large stone that could be rolled into place. Some people have suggested that in that low entrance, the stone was not just a big disc, but it could have been just a big square block, which would still have to be rolled to turn it over and to move it. Okay, I won't argue that one. It could be either. I think it was more likely the disc-shaped stone, but that's an opinion. Shimon Gibson thinks it was a big block. Okay, so the stone was closed by, the entrance was closed by a large stone that could be rolled into place, and the details. The tomb could be closed, right. It was accomplished with a stone, yes, and the stone was large, or as Mark says, very large, and was moved by rolling. All those facts we now see and understand because of archaeology. Let's continue. John 20. The other disciple bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter, who was behind him, arrived and went into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the burial cloth which had been around Jesus' head. By the way, cloth around the head, let me just explain that. The custom was, as you know, the jaw would drop open, and that's not very nice on a corpse. So you close the jaw, and you put a cloth this way round the head to keep the mouth closed. Just the way they used to close the eyes and then put coins on the top to keep the lids down. Now you just use a drop of glue. The New Testament, you've seen the movie too. The tomb was cut out of the rock. It had a doorway or entrance. The doorway was low, yes. The entrance was closed by a large stone, and the burial cloths could be seen. Number 5, we've added. We're building up fact by fact, layer by layer. Let's go to Akeldama. Do you see those little doors at the bottom? They're very small, about this high, about this wide. Okay. And those we call kokhim. That's plural. The singular is kokh. You can, if you don't like Hebrew, you can use Latin and call them loculi, of which the singular is loculus. This little drawing I've done gives you an idea of how it worked. The body was pushed headlong into the tomb, head first, leaving that small entrance, and then a little slab would be put over that opening with the person's name written on it. We know it was head first because archaeology has uncovered some of these where there have been remains of human hair at the far end, as well as the bits of the linen shrouds and other things that the bodies were wrapped in lying there, and the bones usually gone to powder, or to dust. But it gives you an idea of how a kokh or loculus worked. The body was usually left in there for about a year, and then it was taken out again. You say, why? Well, cutting a thing like that by hand out of the rock, especially imagine lying in there and trying to chip at the end to get it to be long enough, was not very easy. They were expensive. Workmen had to be paid. It was arduous. And so they would take the body out, maybe wash the bones in wine, and put them into a bone box, which we call an ossuary, a box about yay big. And that then could be stacked in the corner of the tomb, and you could use the loculus or the kokh again for another burial. Such tombs belonged to families and could be used generation after generation, and were. So it gives you an idea of how it worked. Typical first century tomb plan, the entrance is at the bottom of the screen. You go in, you're in a room cut out of the hillside, and there are all the kokhim or loculi around, and some of them, you see, have little squares inside. Those are the bone boxes that they pushed back into the loculus to get them out of the way. Because the 3 of the loculi here, 4 of them, were not being used for bodies at a given time, and therefore the ossuaries, which simply means bone boxes were pushed in there for storage. So, let's go back to the biblical text. The other disciple, John 20, verse 5, the other disciple bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter, who was behind him, arrived and went into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the burial cloth that had been around Jesus' head. John 20, verse 12, Mary saw two angels in white seated where the body of Jesus had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. Now, this is important information, because let's put that together with archaeology. Remember what we're doing. We're going from the text to the discoveries from archaeology. Jesus could not have been put into a kokh, because how do you get an angel at the head and the foot? Very small angels. Again, the text, the writer of the text was visualizing in his head something different from a kokh. And again, you would be hard put to see the head, the cloth that had been around Jesus' head, because it would have been stuck in at the very far end, unless it had all been pulled out onto the floor. So what are we looking at? Let's continue. The tomb of Ariston, in the same area, by the way. This is a different kind of burial place. It's called an arcosolium, which simply means an arched recess. A little recess cut back in the wall with an arch over the top, and the body would have been laid in sideways on that shelf, on that slab, and there's another one, as you can see, on the left. This was a particular form of burial that was very favored by Christians, by the way, later in Rome, in the catacombs. If you go to the catacombs, you will see that they are filled with the arcosolia, all down the road, and many of them. So it became very popular among Christians, and I'm wondering why. Do you think it was that there was an arcosolium in the tomb of Jesus? It might certainly fit, especially if the shelf were a little bit wider at the end, so a person could sort of sit there. But anyway, there we are, a different possibility. So, the burial cloths could be seen if the tomb had an arcosolium, or a shelf of rock. And this was, I've not shown you this, but very often in tombs there's just like a little shelf which they would put lamps and different stuff on as they were doing the burial, you know. And if there was a shelf of rock where the body could be placed before being put in a kokh for burial, and if it was in line of sight from the entrance, you'd have to have a line of sight from the entrance, from what we've read. But you see, it's perfectly possible that in the tomb there was simply a slab or shelf where they put the body, planning to come back. Remember, it was in a hurry. Friday evening, the Sabbath was coming, they had to get it over fast. They were going to come back on Monday and take care of it. So maybe they were going to put the body on a shelf of rock and then come back to put it into a kokh, slide it in on Monday morning, which never, of course, happened, but that's what they were planning to do. So that would explain how the body could be seen. So there are several possibilities. But you see, archaeology is starting to answer questions, but it's raising more. That's the way of it. For every question you answer, you get 10 more questions, and you get 10 answers, you get 100 questions, and so it goes on. It's exponential, I think. Here is this interplay of discovery and text. Matthew 27, verse 57, and then 59 to 60. There came a rich man from Joseph of Arimathea named Joseph. Now, it had to be a rich man, because it was only well-to-do families that could afford rock-cut tombs like this. Ordinary people were not put into this kind of elaborate burial. So, rich man, that figures, who had himself become a disciple of Jesus. Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and placed it in his own new tomb. New is going to become important, that had been cut out of the rock. He rolled a big stone in front of the entrance and went away. Why is new tomb important? Probably unfinished. Enough to take care of the burial for now. Now, this is again from Leen Ritmeyer, and this is what Leen suggests. That he's suggesting here is a rolling stone that goes in front of a low entrance, and instead of the whole tomb having been cut out, he thinks it had only had one chamber with a shelf, and the body could be put on that shelf. So the new tomb was important. On the other hand, Shimon Gibson, this is not, I should say, his drawing, this is my drawing, but I've based it on his and his information, and I've made some slight changes according to what I've interpreted the text. There is the entrance. He has a square plug for the stone. I put a disc. It looks in, you can just see at an angle where the head would have been. You wouldn't be able to see the foot. On the right side is an arcosolium, but there's a shelf or ledge in front, which would be, a person could sit at the front, at the foot and the head. So there's the way I've tried to put it together. Am I right? I don't know. It's speculative. It always is when you're trying to put things together like this. More information comes and more questions are answered, but it gives you an idea. So, summary. The details about the tomb of Jesus described in the New Testament fit precisely with what we know from archaeology about Jewish burial customs in the first century. Now, that's nice. I think it would have been virtually impossible for somebody, let us say in the 2nd century, to have written the Gospels account of the resurrection, because this kind of burial finished with the First Temple period, and the First Temple period finished in the year 70. So somebody at the end of the 1st century would remember how burials were done in Jerusalem before the destruction of the temple, and they would be able to describe it quite clearly. But once you get into the 2nd century, you're getting a little far removed to get all the details right. And all the details are right. And how do we know they're right? Only because of the results of excavation and discovery around Jerusalem and in other parts of Israel through archaeology. So you see how that fits together. Whoops, I turned it off. Let's go back on. Oh, good. This helps us to understand what the New Testament text is saying and also to visualize what it's saying. I don't know whether you've got a visual mind. I do. I think in pictures all the time. And so to me, it is very important, as I read the text, for me to see it like a movie in front of me, and I watch things play out. And that's important to the way I read the text. And I think it helps in exegesis, because in hermeneutics and in exegesis, it is important to bring as many tools in as we can to see what is the text saying and what is it not saying. It also affirms the historical accuracy of the New Testament and shows, as I've just said, it could not have been composed long after the events it describes. Well, my thanks to the Biblical Archaeology Society for some slides, also to Ritmeyer Archaeological Design, and to Derek Lewis for a slide of the Jezreel tomb.